today's call. The first objective is to discuss the important role faith leaders and faith communities play as key partners in suicide prevention efforts. We'll also describe the recently released suicide prevention competencies for faith leaders and how to implement this resource into community-based suicide prevention efforts. And we'll also highlight opportunities to get involved with the upcoming National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, and Life, which will take place September 6th through 8th. As an organization that receives federal funding, we need to be sure to share the following disclaimer with you before we begin. And we're so pleased to have 3 exceptional partners with us today, each of whom will share their unique perspectives on the role of faith leaders and communities in suicide prevention. First, we'll hear from Mr. Brandon Johnson, who is the public sector co-lead of the Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force. He is a public health advisor with the Center for Mental Health Services at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Next, we'll hear from Reverend Drew Stockstill, who is pastor and director of health ministries at Christ Lutheran Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Karen Mason, who is a member of the Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force. She is a professor of counseling and psychology at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Today, we'll review who the Action Alliance is and the work that we do. We'll highlight the role of faith leaders play in suicide prevention, as well as some specific Action Alliance initiatives aimed at engaging faith communities. We'll hear a community perspective from the local faith leader. We'll review the recently released suicide prevention competencies for faith leaders. And finally, there will be time at the end to address some of your questions. I'd like to start out by providing you with a brief overview of the Action Alliance. We are the nation's public-private partnership for suicide prevention. We bring together more than 250 national partners from diverse sectors to make suicide prevention a national priority and to advance the national strategy for suicide prevention. We make it a priority to work with a very diverse sectors and industries, including faith communities, because we recognize everyone has a role to play in suicide prevention. The Action Alliance Administrative Home is the Education Development Center, or EDC. EDC is also home to the federally funded National Suicide Prevention Resource Center and the Zero Suicide Institute, which focuses on suicide prevention in healthcare and behavioral health settings. The National Strategy for Suicide Prevention serves as our roadmap for a coordinated, comprehensive approach to suicide prevention. As the nation's public-private partnership, we work towards advancing goals and objectives from the national strategy that focus on systems-level changes. Our 3 priority areas are transforming health systems, transforming communities, and changing the conversation about suicide. Today, we'll be focusing on our work to transform communities by partnering and engaging with faith communities. I'm pleased now to turn it over to Mr. Brandon Johnson, who will walk through the Action Alliance efforts to engage faith leaders and communities. Brandon?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maureen. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm so excited to be sharing as a part of this webinar today and to have you all join us and have so many people from various different backgrounds. We have mental health professionals on today's webinar. We have faith leaders, faith communities, suicide prevention experts, etc. on today's call. So first, I want to welcome you on behalf of the Faith Communities Task Force of the National Action Alliance, which I co-lead with Dr. Melinda Moore. And we are so excited to have you all here as a part of Faith, Hope, Life, and to talk about the role of faith leaders in suicide prevention. And my role is SAMHSA. I have the privilege to work across around 4 different suicide prevention grant programs, the majority of them being focused on youth between the ages of 10 and 24, and I also work with adult grants. I am also the government project officer for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, as well as the National Action Alliance. So I'm so really proud of the work that each of them does, and so I want to take this time to thank the Action Alliance team for putting this together, for helping us to manage the task force and the other task force as a part of the National Action Alliance. So I want to take this time as well to thank them for their hard work and efforts. So let's go ahead and get started. And so why focus on faith communities? Maureen mentioned the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention. As you can see on the webinar slides, the link is there to be able to access this document. And so what this is basically our roadmap for suicide prevention across the country. It was created in 2012. It was released and published for the general public, and there are different aspects to the strategy. And so there are a couple of goals we want to highlight here, and I'll go into kind of why we're highlighting those. And so we have goal 1 about integrating and coordinating suicide prevention across multiple sectors and settings, increasing knowledge of the factors that offer protection from suicidal behaviors. And goal 10, providing care and support to individuals affected by suicide deaths and attempts. These are three of the goals in the strategy, and these really connect with faith leaders and with faith communities and their role in suicide prevention. Literature has shown that most individuals who are a part of a faith community feel more comfortable going to their faith leader or someone within their faith community around the issue that they're having around mental health before they would actually go to a mental health provider. This is key for the work that we're doing. There's a sense of trust with the faith community. There is a sense of belonging with the faith community. There's been many research studies that have looked at the association between mental health and religiosity and spirituality. And studies have shown increases in overall access to mental health care, to overall health care, to better overall life satisfaction, to greater self-esteem, decreased depression for individuals who attend religious services on a regular basis, regular at least being twice a month, and also reductions in depressive mood as well. And because of this, what we want to do is that we at the Faith Community Task Force want to equip faith communities and faith leaders with the tools and resources to be able to assist individuals when they come to them for help when they are struggling with suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior, as well as individuals in faith communities who may have lost someone to suicide. And so our role is to really help faith communities be able to do that. And so this is myself and Dr. Melinda Moore, and our titles and what we do as a part of the Faith Community Task Force of the National Action Alliance. And so the task force was birthed from a need to be able to provide resources and information for faith leaders and faith communities who want to be engaged in suicide prevention. What we wanted to do was also make sure that the resources that we had could cover a multitude of faith communities. There are different spiritual texts, different belief systems and things, and we wanted to be as inclusive as possible with the resources and things that we provided to the overall population and the overall depth and breadth of faith communities across the country. And so I'm going to go into and transition to some of our strategies now, some of the things that we've been working on for a few years now, and some of our newer projects and newer efforts that we are moving into during our next couple of years. And so first, as you see here, this is our web page, and the web hyperlink is there below in the corner of the slide. And so one of our strategies is to establish national partners and scaling up marketing and dissemination efforts for key audiences around Faith, Hope, Life. And so during our time in working with the task force, we've been able to partner with many organizations to collaborate and to help us disseminate information around Faith, Hope, Life. Currently, there are many of our local sectors across states have been able to disseminate and promote a lot of the things that we've been able to do. Been in talks to work with Maryland. The state of Utah has been a great partner in disseminating Faith Hope Life resources to their faith community, as well as states such as Oklahoma that have been very receptive to sending out information and sharing some of the resources and things that we've created. We also work with suicide prevention entities to provide them with resources, as well as work with large faith communities and governing bodies and seminaries and schools of worship to be able to provide them resources as well. And so this is the Faith Hope Life campaign. The picture that you see in the corner is from our website, the screenshot of the website, and it's our resources and materials section. I would ask that everybody who's here on the webinar, if you haven't taken the time to look at our resources, I would definitely encourage you to do so. Throughout the year and under our previous leadership, we've created many resources across faith communities, and we have them broken down by faith communities so individuals, when they go on the website, can easily find resources that would be beneficial to them. So we have information and resources as well as sample prayers. We have webinars that we've completed in the past, and this one will be added to that list as well. Communication tools is a big one that we have. Many faith communities and faith leaders may see a need to address suicide, to increase their suicide prevention efforts, and sometimes are worried about just how the individuals within their faith community will respond to that, and to know how to communicate it in a way that's safe, in a way that's responsible, and in a way that feels very inclusive and not stigmatizing. And so we have communication tools and even templates on our website to help faith leaders be able to do that. So definitely take a look at it if you haven't already. We hope that the materials there are helpful and are things that will help you in your journey in incorporating suicide prevention within your faith community. Another thing I'll say as co-lead, if you go on the site and you look through it and there are some things there that you don't see, some things that you think might be helpful, definitely reach out to us. We would love to hear from you and start conversations. While we can't do everything at once, we do have the ability to kind of shift our focus and look around a bit to see where there are gaps, to see if there are other people working on specific topics, and seeing eventually how we can add some new things to our work plan. So definitely, if you see something there or don't see something there that you would like to talk to us about, we would love to hear from you. Going back to some additional strategies, building awareness among faith communities, faith leaders around the National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, and Life. And so this was mentioned briefly before by Maureen. This effort happens typically the first weekend in September. And so what we ask and invite faith communities to do is to pledge to pray for individuals who've been touched by suicide, who've been impacted by suicide, who are dealing with concerns and feelings of hopelessness, or who may also have lost a loved one, a friend, a confidant to suicide. And many people will ask, why just pray? There's so much more that faith communities are equipped to do, and we agree with that. However, from data, the average size of a place of worship in the country is around 70 to 75 individuals. So if a faith community or a place of worship won't do anything else or can't do anything else, they will absolutely pray for you. We have found this to be very impactful for the faith communities that have participated as a part of it. We've had large uptake in Utah and in other states such as Kentucky and in Maryland. All over the country, we've had individuals do this and talk to us about the impact that it had. We had one faith community in particular there was a sermon that was given around suicide and suicide prevention, and what happened was after the sermon, there was a visitor who said that the sermon may have saved their life, and they were able to get connected to services. And also, there was a place of worship that said that there were numerous parents who came forward about noticing some suicidal ideation among their children, and the place of worship was able to create a referral list for the parents in their congregation to be able to send their youth to out in the community to get them services. And so this is some of the impact that the National Weekend of Prayer has had. And in Utah, the governor and lieutenant governor issued a press release encouraging faith leaders to participate. There have been walks that have been created as a part of the National Weekend of Prayer as well. And so we really want to promote this, encourage faith leaders, faith communities, and even individuals. If you are an individual and you feel led to participate and you want to pray yourself for individuals who've been impacted, we encourage you to do that as well. To talk about how to get involved, on the website there is a drop-down for the National Weekend of Prayer, and so we ask people to do a few things. One, we want you to pledge to participate. Say that you're going to participate, and we ask for just minimum contact information. One, to keep you in a part of our network, so when webinars like this happen, we can let you know, as well as to be able to follow up, to see how things have gone, to open up communication so you all can let us know and share if it's been impactful, what it meant to you, how you've seen your faith community kind of grow as a part of it. Those are things that we want to know because we want to disseminate that across the country so we can have as many examples as possible for other faith communities and faith leaders who are interested but not necessarily sure how it'll turn out, how it'll go, or just ideas of how to get started. Two, we want you to participate. Integrate it however you want to. If it's a prayer, that's great. If it's if it's a sermon, perhaps, that's great. If it's resources, that's wonderful. If it's a walk, that's awesome too. So however you want to participate and be engaged, we definitely encourage you to do so. And just remember that there are resources and things on our website to help you with this. And then promote. Share with other faith leaders and faith communities. Share with mental health agencies. Share with suicide prevention partners. Share with crisis centers. Share with your state suicide prevention coordinator, etc. Share it far and wide. We definitely want to increase awareness that this event is happening. Some other strategies that are more so working kind of in the future. Some of them have just kind of gotten off the ground. One is that we are currently working on a work group to create resources and materials for youth ministries. This is something that I am youth lead at my church in Baltimore, and there are things that our youth are experiencing younger and younger that are leading many to die by suicide and to have suicidal thoughts. There have been increases over the past about 15 years with youth suicide, and the rate is as high as it's ever been. And so with this, we know that faith leaders and faith leaders around youth ministries who work with youth, who are charged to be connected to the youth, need more materials on, what to do. How do I engage this topic in a safe way? How do I address concerns from a parent? Where do I refer youth to? Or just what's my role? What should I be doing? What shouldn't I do? These are things that we are looking into and want to create. So we are just in the process of getting that started now. The other one is chaplaincy in public safety, military, hospital, and other settings. We just created a tool for that, and so Dr. Mason will talk about that in a bit. But we're looking to develop faith leaders' competencies around suicide prevention as well. And a few more strategies is to, one of the things we want to do is create a network for faith leaders to be able to talk about their experiences as being a faith leader in addressing the topic of suicide. It is a tough thing to deal with and a tough topic to talk about in general. Faith leaders often have the task of comforting a family after a loved one dies by suicide, of doing a memorial service with a family who's lost a person, lost an individual to suicide, or even having individuals in their places of worship talk to them one-on-one about their suicidal ideation. And so we want to create a network and ability for faith leaders to be able to talk and to discuss and to be able to kind of share notes about what things have worked and what things haven't. Another major part of this is that we want to take care of our faith leaders. There's a lot that we ask of them. There's a lot that is put on the call that they have for their life. And so what we want to do is to make sure that they have resources and things to take care of themselves, to do self-care, to be able to talk about, the difficulties of doing what they do. And so this is another very key aspect that we, as a task force, want to address, and we'll be doing that within, this is an ongoing project that we'll be taking up over the next few years. And also convening faith leaders in states and communities to connect them to suicide prevention. And so we want suicide prevention to know that the faith community is there and that they're being equipped to work in suicide prevention. And we want faith leaders to know how to get in contact with entities and agencies working on suicide prevention within their areas. This has to be a cohesive, connected effort as well. So we want two sides to meet in the middle and to be able to push this and move this forward. And so we're also disseminating the faith leader competencies, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But this is our newest project, our newest resource that we've been sharing across the country. And so now I am going to turn it over, and you'll hear from a faith leader, Reverend Stockhill, about his perspective on the intersection of faith and suicide prevention. And so I appreciate him taking the time to be able to do this, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Hey, everybody. I just want to start off and tell you that it is just an honor to be with all of you because you are each doing really important work. And I want to thank you for the ways that you are already providing light and hope in people's lives and for your vital role in preventing suicide. My name is Drew, and I'm a Presbyterian pastor. I have been for about 7 years, and I'm currently serving a Lutheran congregation in Pennsylvania's capital city of Harrisburg. And from the very beginning of my ministry, I have understood just how vital my role as a faith leader is in suicide prevention. And I have used my gifts as a faith leader in preventing suicide. And I have also, as have many of you, I'm sure, had congregants and colleagues and friends who have died by suicide, and so have been a part of supporting survivors. My great hope for today is that those of you who are faith leaders leave this call feeling empowered, that you already have the gifts and ability to be part of suicide prevention and intervention. And I also hope that those of you who may not yourselves be faith leaders will do just like Brandon said, and build relationships with faith leaders in your community and help empower them to use their gifts in suicide prevention. There are a wealth of resources on suicide prevention available to faith leaders. The Presbyterian Church USA, the ELCA websites each have pages devoted to resources on suicide prevention and support of survivors for faith communities. Your faith communities may as well. That Action Alliance website that was mentioned earlier, I've looked at it, I've been on it, I've used it. It's full of helpful resources. I really encourage you to spend some time there. But faith leaders should also make use of the resources within our own religious teachings and theologies. People in our communities often want to know what a religion has to say about various issues, including suicide. As a Protestant Christian, I'll speak from my own context, but I encourage you to think about the theology that supports your practice of suicide prevention. In nearly every faith tradition, there is a theology that values life. But it's not enough to simply say that. It should be said. But too many people have been told simply to pray about it and God will heal them. And they could be left feeling helpless when their situation doesn't improve. Our traditions give us tools to enable us to go deeper with people who are suffering than just saying, please don't kill yourself, or value life, or pray harder. I want to encourage faith leaders to dig deeper into our scriptures and our theologies and see that many of our traditions also give us tools which equip us to walk with people into their various situations, no matter how dark they might be. Doing so will help people feel less isolated and less shame about what they're going through. In my Christian tradition, the Bible is full of stories of hope in desperate times. These stories illustrate people going through very, very dark times, feeling overwhelmed, feeling isolated and alone, feelings that we all have at times, but often feel that we're alone when we experience them. But sharing stories as faith leaders helps people feel less isolated and develop their own sense of hope and possibility. For example, in the Bible, King David shows profound grief, painfully mourning after the death of his friend Jonathan and then his own son Absalom. There are stories of surviving grief. Tamar finds agency in the Bible as a survivor of abuse. Jesus shows us times of being completely empty. Angels come and tend to him. Times of weeping, grieving a friend, despairing in a garden, abandoned by his friends. Paul demonstrates his own shame cycle and the weight that he carries, but he has a system to remember, to remind himself of grace, that he is forgiven, that his life is valuable. And he, as a faith leader, equips other communities and helps them build resiliency, empowers them with this truth. And then the Psalms cover the full scope of human emotion. Jesus relied on Psalm 22 in his darkest hour. I've used Psalm 88 in preventing suicide. Psalm 88 is the only psalm in the Bible that offers no positive word, no sign of hope. The psalmist is crying out to God, who he says does not hear. He says he feels like he's dying. He's without strength. He's overwhelmed by wave after wave of life's challenges. He's totally alone. And on he goes. The psalmist blames God for all of it. The last line of Psalm 88 says, "You have taken my friends and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend." The end. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to share a message like this with someone who is suffering, but as Brandon shared about the darkness that so many of our youth are experiencing, I think Psalm 88 can be exactly what might help someone. I once met a high school athlete, the super jock, who was suffering all alone in ways he thought no one could imagine. He didn't want to scare his parents with what he was going through. He was getting in fights at school. He was becoming isolated. He felt completely alone. And he felt certain that when he talked to me that all I'd want to do is cheer him up, and he was having none of that. So I asked him if I could read him Psalm 88. And by the end, this tough high school jock was sobbing on a park bench. He said, "That's exactly how I feel." It was a lifeline from Scripture dropped all the way to the bottom of a pit. It told him even here, even if you need to blame it all on God, God can handle it, even in the depths, even when thinking about suicide. Nothing can keep you from God's love. Hearing his pain named so truly in Scripture told him that he was truly seen, not only by the pastor, the lifeline, the person who could connect him to resources sitting right in front of him, but also by God, that he was not alone. An epilogue on that, a few years later, I saw that kid again, and he was leading a youth group. Most important to suicide prevention is that faith leaders have the opportunity to provide messages of hope for our communities. We celebrate and value the importance of life. We tell stories of resiliency, people overcoming challenges and adversity, all which cast glimmers of light, all of which give hope to people who are suffering, all of which push against feelings of isolation. You may not think of yourselves as actively preventing suicide when you talk about hope and celebrate life and share stories of people surviving, but you are. When stories of people who have died by suicide circulate, your messages of people living, they push against the risk of contagion. Your messages can and do teach people about the importance of the value of their own lives, and that is a key part of suicide prevention, a role that you have already been playing for people who may never let you know how vital your words and presence have been to their survival. So I hope you feel empowered. There are likely valuable assets within your community to help you learn more about suicide prevention. The most helpful teachings for me as a pastor in preventing suicide have come from members of my own community and congregation. I began my ministry as a Presbyterian campus minister at Emory University, and I attended a presentation put on by the Department of Student Life on suicide prevention. And there I was given cards with the numbers of suicide prevention hotlines. I always have those numbers handy. Most crucially, I learned that if I have even the slightest question that a person may be thinking about suicide, I should just straight up ask them, John, have you thought about killing yourself? Just ask, be direct. They told us, you will not plant the idea in someone's mind if they're not thinking about suicide. You may startle them with the bluntness and the nature of the question, but that's okay. That can even be a wake-up call for someone who may be heading towards a crisis. Statistically, faith leaders say they are willing to ask that question, but they often stop there. The next question, the question of intent, is where I was most empowered. John, how have you thought about killing yourself? What is your plan? This question tells you the person is having more than suicidal thoughts. They have a plan and perhaps even the means to carry it out. Here is where you as a faith leader should feel most empowered to actively intervene. Here's how this played out just a couple of months ago in my own congregation. A woman came to my church on a Sunday afternoon after worship. She asked to see the pastor. She was calm, but upon seeing me, immediately became tearful. She exhibited signs of being in crisis. She was exhausted, depressed, felt overwhelmed. Her adult son had recently been admitted to the hospital after attempting suicide. And as we talked, I had a feeling that I needed to ask, Ruth, are you thinking about killing yourself? She looked startled, and she bowed her head in shame. She nodded and wept. I waited. Ruth, have you thought about how you would commit suicide? Do you want to kill yourself right now? She said, yes. Why can't I? And here is how we know the vital role faith leaders play in suicide intervention. We can help answer that question that somebody may be longing to ask, but are too afraid or too ashamed. That, why can't I? I said, Ruth, because while this is a very, very hard time, your life is so special, and you can live. And I'm going to call 911 now, okay? And they will send police and an ambulance, okay? She said, okay. The first responders were calm, compassionate, well-equipped to care for Ruth. One of the police officers said to me as he was leaving, "Pastor, she knew where to find help." Our job as faith leaders is to cultivate that openness and to be prepared with these simple ways to respond. You can share these simple tools with members of your communities. Those of you with organizations who work in suicide prevention, visit your local places of worship and offer your guidance. Let them know that it's worth asking the questions, that it's worth making the calls. Give them all the numbers that they need. I equip members of my own community with these tools. People are receptive. They are looking for guidance. They want to know what to do. They often feel so empowered when they know they can do something. These are empowering tools to share with our communities. I encourage you to talk openly in your community about suicide. Gather a few people who are willing to be empowered to intervene. Maybe create a care committee or a group like the Deacons. Teach people that they too can play a vital role in supporting their friends and their family. But also explore the depths of your faith tradition and help people see that they are never truly alone. As dark as the night may get, someone can relate to what they're going through. And that someone may be a voice from Scripture or a story that you've shared, a word of hope that you've given. And that is the line that they need to reach out for help. I also just encourage you to build a list of professionals around you that you can refer to people to when they need access to greater mental health care. Thank you again for all that you do. You are so important and valuable in this work. I'd like to hand it back over to Brandon now.
Wow, thank you very much, Reverend Stockstill, for that. That was incredible. So thank you so much for you sharing your perspective. Wow, I'm rarely speechless, but I might be right now. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so now we're going to go, no problem. So now we're going to go into our suicide prevention competencies for faith leaders, which I mentioned earlier. And we have Dr. Karen Mason, who was very integral in creating this document, of helping it come to life. And so thank you, first of all, for your involvement with the document. And I will turn it over to you to kind of go through it and walk us through some of the aspects of that document. Dr. Mason?
Well, thank you, Brandon, and thank you so much also, Pastor Drew, for sharing your perspective. I also, like Brandon, was very inspired by it, so thank you. I'm so pleased to be with you all today. I am pleased especially to talk about the suicide prevention competencies for faith leaders. Out of my own experience, I used to manage the Office of Suicide Prevention for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And as in that role, we were sending out suicide prevention materials to all kinds of professionals like PCPs, EAP providers, home health care staff, school counselors. And we wanted to send out materials to faith leaders and faith communities as well, but we didn't know what to send them because we weren't entirely sure 10 years ago what do faith leaders do, what are faith communities doing. And I am just so thankful for the suicide prevention competencies for faith leaders, which was launched here in just this past April 2019, because it is a document that helps to equip faith leaders with capabilities needed to prevent suicide and provide care and comfort to all those affected by suicide. And one of the things I feel that has come out so strongly in this document is just that faith leaders and faith communities engage this issue of suicide prevention very, very broadly. And I think Pastor Drew just gave us just an excellent example of that. And there were many of us, I should say, who worked on this project, but I just want to give special mention to Glenn Bloomstrom, who provided leadership to us as we worked on this project for over 2 years. So Glenn works with Living Works. He's a retired military chaplain. And so, Glenn, thanks for your leadership on this project. One of the things that's important to know about this before we launch into some of the competencies is just that there were 3 streams that came together that contributed to developing these competencies. And so let me tell you a little bit about each one. And they're each just a little bit different from one another. So Dr. Doreen Marshall is the author of the first one, which is a clergy work group on suicide prevention and aftercare. So SBRC and the Link banded together and convened 20 individuals representing clergy, faith-based groups, survivors, suicide prevention stakeholders in 2005 to really understand clergy needs around suicide prevention, but also to develop critical elements for a competency-based curriculum to train clergy. And I think this was just such an important seminal start to this whole work that we did. The second stream was the Department of Defense developed the Suicide Prevention Training Competency Framework in 2014. There are some newer versions if you go look on the internet. But the key goal was to identify core knowledge, skills, abilities, and characteristics for suicide prevention training and education across DoD components and services. One of the things that is unique about this particular work is that it was really targeting not just clergy, not just chaplains, but also healthcare professionals and families of service members. And then the third stream is actually work that I did with 2 colleagues, Dr. Monica Geist and Molly Clark. We did a grounded theory, which is basically a series of interviews. We interviewed 19 Protestant clergy about how do you engage the issue of suicide in faith community. And what's unique about grounded theory is that you do these interviews until you start hearing nothing new. So you do the interviews until you reach saturation. So for us, that was 19 clergy. About half of them were parish clergy, half military clergy. And I think one of the things that's important is just that a great deal of research is being done right now on military chaplains, and I think it is really important to have that parish faith leader perspective. But the other unique piece about the work that we did is we were really looking at how these competencies develop over 4 stages. So what does that competency look like early in the faith leader's career, and then sort of a little bit farther on and a little farther on, and then what does it look like when they're out there inspiring others to get involved? So we based on those interviews, we found 10 competencies, and you can go look them up in the article if you want. But we then went back to the research. We reread Doreen Marshall's work and other, reflected on further interviews that sort of impromptu interviews that happened with clergy, and we added 5 more competencies. So we came up with 15. So all of these 3 streams came together to develop these competencies. Now, one other piece I should mention, in addition to the work group, we then surveyed the whole National Action Alliance, and not just the work group, but the whole National Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force to get input into all of these competencies. And one of the things I just want to point out from this list here, you can see there are 6 general categories, but one of the things that I hope really stands out is that clergy or faith leaders and faith communities engage this issue of suicide prevention very broadly, from prevention to intervention to postvention. But there are also specific issues that we wanted to highlight, and these were communication, how pastors provide, how mentorship occurs to the younger kind of earlier career ministers, and then what happens in unique organizational settings. So we were realizing as we were doing our work that parish clergy are different from military clergy, who are different from hospital or corporate chaplains. So there's just a broad array of how faith leaders engage this particular issue because of the variety of settings in which a faith leader might find him, herself, or themselves. So just a very broad way that they engage suicide prevention. Now, the suggestion that we want to make is to actually use these competencies. Now, one of the things we have on here a list in terms of helping to develop courses or training programs or policies or evaluating programs. But I just want to go back to the earlier statement for myself, having worked in suicide prevention at the state level. I think that utilizing the competencies could also inform what kinds of materials that you want to send to faith leaders and to faith communities, just kind of knowing how broadly they engage this issue of suicide prevention. But if you take these particular suggestions, you can sort of think about particular categories in terms of how you might utilize these competencies in different kinds of settings. So I teach in a seminary. I do teach a suicide prevention class to Master's of Divinity students, and I absolutely used the competencies in developing the training just to make sure that the training was going to include all of these different areas. You can utilize these competencies to develop not entire courses, but specific trainings. I use it all the time when I go out and talk to faith leaders, both professional and lay leaders in faith communities. So, you know, many times the training can include all of the competencies, but there are certain ones that, say, a particular group might be interested in more than others. We also want to suggest that religious denominations, so especially groups that ordain people to ministry. Brandon was talking about calling, so people who are called professionally to the ministry, the groups that ordain them might actually use the competencies in thinking about how these folks are prepared and whether they're prepared for some of the examples of what Pastor Drew was giving us in terms of how he has engaged this issue in his faith community. And then last but definitely not least, programs for clinical pastoral education. So many times chaplains are the folks who go through CPE training. CPE training could also use these competencies to reflect on content of training that is going to help prepare faith leaders to be able to engage suicide in whatever setting they're going to find themselves in. Now, Brandon was mentioning this, but I'll just point specifically to this study. So one of the reasons for the competencies, just to go back and circle around and give you that rationale, the National Comorbidity Survey was a nationally representative study that was done, and 25% of people with all types of mental health disorders contacted clergy for help, with suicidal ideation plans or attempts as some of the significant predictors of making contact, just as in the example that Pastor Drew gave us. And suicidal people who sought treatment were as likely to contact clergy as other providers. So I think it's just important to know that the reason that we're encouraging the use of these competencies is just that we know that clergy are going to engage this issue when they find themselves in the ministry. Now, some very kind person included this in the document, a quote from my book on preventing suicide. But this is the point I want to come back to, which just Pastor Drew just made this point beautifully. But the faith leaders and faith communities have such a unique role in suicide prevention because of the way they uniquely support life from prevention to intervention to postvention. And if I can think about my own professional identity as a psychologist, I might find it hard to answer a client's question, do I have the right to take my life? But a faith leader is going to wade right into those questions. And the research that I've done with my colleagues suggests that while faith leaders focus on caring pastorally for hurting people, as Pastor Drew gave us in his example, they stand for life, they support life. And not that I as a psychologist don't also, but there's a way in which the intersection of theology and moral practice in which they live plays out in their professional work, in their professional ministry differently than it will with other professionals. Now, the other piece as a psychologist that I'm never going to bump into is having to deliver a memorial service or a funeral sermon with a person. So let me just give you three postvention examples that I think hopefully highlight for you just the unique contribution that faith leaders and faith communities make in suicide prevention, just by talking about these, just as an example, three of the competencies. So competency 3.1.8 says this: I watch for people vulnerable to contagion, those closest to the decedent, and youth who looked up to the individual. So one of the things I think that's so key that faith leaders do is that in that postvention piece, they are in a position to monitor for suicide contagion in their faith community. Looking at the next one, 3.2.1, when a suicide death happens, I take the culture of survivors into account, how they experience, display, and process emotions, beliefs about death and the afterlife, rituals to address the death, and comfort level in speaking about the deceased. Again, the faith leaders have a unique intersection with how postvention occurs in a faith community in the way that culture is taken into account. And then the last example, and there are many other examples we could talk about in the document. I'm just trying to give a few examples here to give you a flavor of some of these competencies. But 3.3.1 says, when a suicide death happens, I know how to conduct a memorial service or ceremony that is helpful to survivors and congregants while seeking to prevent contagion and increased risk among those attending. And I have to say, I just think that this is such a challenge for faith leaders for how to strike that balance between, supporting life and preventing contagion while at the same time honoring the deceased, and at the same time setting the congregation on a course of healing and the family of the survivors as well. So faith leaders are intersecting with suicide prevention in very unique ways, and hopefully this document of faith leader suicide prevention competencies just point out how key faith leaders are in terms of being partners in suicide prevention. So let me also add my thanks to all of you and the work that you're doing in suicide prevention. And Brendan, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for jumping in to walk us through really the journey of how we got to this place. We've been receiving some really strong feedback around the competencies. We've had many places talk about how they've been helpful. I know that it's been shared too from some of our friends at HRSA and the Partnership Center, the HHS Partnership Center, and so definitely appreciate them sending it out. And so one of the things that we've gotten as positive feedback is how the competencies are written, that it's really more so of a place of, kind of like introspection, but not of a place of judgment of like, you have to do this, have to have that, but just kind of having the faith leader kind of think through, kind of what they're able to do and what they're comfortable doing. And so we've gotten a lot of feedback that that approach has been really well received. So thank you for all your hard work on it. And you mentioned Glenn earlier as well. Can't thank him enough for his hard work on this and the entire committee that worked on that together. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Maureen to help facilitate our discussion.
Thanks, Brandon. And just as a reminder to everyone, please use the Q&A portion of your screen if you have any questions for any of our speakers. We do have a few minutes left here to be able to answer those questions, so please be sure to get those in, and we will go ahead and get questions answered. And while we wait for some questions to come in, we can go ahead and start with talking a little bit about National Weekend of Prayer. And Pastor Drew, I don't know if you are planning on participating or if you've participated previously, but from a pastor's perspective, kind of how do you foresee congregations getting involved with a weekend like that? And are there things or steps that you've taken previously to participate?
Yeah, absolutely. This will be our first year participating in that, but we are eager to do so as a congregation. The timing also is right, as we lost somebody who was a good friend of the congregation recently who died by suicide, and so it's very much on the hearts and minds of people in our community. So the way that we're going to engage it is just very locally, thinking about the way that it's impacting us, and praying. Prayer is probably going to be the key way, but it will also give us a chance to celebrate life, point out where we see it, and try and strike that balance that Karen talked about, of both naming what we have lost, and also trying to move towards hope and stories of resiliency. So we are excited to begin to be a part of that.
Great, thank you for sharing that. One of the questions that just came in, and I guess this would go back to Pastor Drew, you again, is what suggestions do you have with regards to approaching church leaders initially in terms of suicide prevention training? So if you're coming from the suicide prevention field and you're looking to engage a local church community or leaders, what kind of suggestions do you have around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple ways. The way that I first encountered that myself as a pastor was, like I said, at Emory University. They were putting that on for a lot of people who are working with college students, but I thought that's a great way to present that information, is to publicize an event of a very concise training. I think that training was of all of maybe 30 minutes, and it was somebody who came from that department. And so I think something like that, to host a small training and send invitations out to local leaders and invite them to bring people from their congregations and name very upfront what it is. I also think cold calling is welcome. We get cold called all the time. We get emails all the time. We get messages on Facebook. So start Googling what are the religious worshiping communities around me, and call the local leaders there and say who you are and what services that you offer, and you would love to offer some assistance. Maybe go out for coffee, something like that. So it could be something as formal as putting on a presentation or a training that they're invited to, or that really personal few minutes in an office, I just want to talk to you about how you might be able to impact suicide prevention.
Great, thanks for those insights. And Karen, we have a question regarding in the faith competencies and some of the post-vention pieces that you went over. There was a part that talked about seeking to prevent contagion and increased risk among those attending. And can you speak to kind of what that means and how to go about doing that?
Mm-hmm. I think probably one of the helpful things would be to read a book about that sort of thing in terms of contagion. And I'm thinking about Dr. Thomas Joyner's book on why people die by suicide. I think, getting sort of a fuller exposure to that might be better than, sort of a halfway statement that I might make. Generally speaking, when you're thinking about contagion usually happens with younger people and young adults, or people who are vulnerable in some kind of way. So I think it's good to give some thought to the people who might be vulnerable, who either knew the deceased person well or had some kind of a connection to that person. I think, and what's challenging about contagion is that it's going to be different depending on the circumstances of the suicide death. So another resource could be some of the responses to suicide response protocols that you find in school settings sometimes are just as valuable in faith community settings. So getting your hands on a response to suicide in a school setting can sometimes be helpful. That will also give you some information about managing contagion. So hopefully those will get you started.
Great, thank you. And it seems like we're getting a lot of questions around kind of how do you start the conversation with faith leaders, how do you approach faith leaders, and so I don't know if Brandon has any insights from his perspective that might be helpful to share with the group.
Sure. So this is a question we get often, and when I go out and talk to people, this is one that kind of comes up a lot. Really kind of how do you get the conversation going with your faith leader about kind of bringing some awareness to this being an issue and wanting to address it within your place of worship, within your faith community. One of the things that has been helpful, and what people have told me has been helpful, and even in my work of approaching faith leaders, is really just to outline and to talk about the impact of of suicide and thinking through, how many people are impacted by suicide across this country, and thinking that there are people most likely in your faith community that have dealt with it, that have struggled with, whether it be suicidal ideation, whether it be a loss of a loved one, or a friend, or someone who's made a previous attempt on their life, that at some point, if not at that very moment, probably they are, but if not at that very moment, there will be people who are dealing with this, who are coming through your faith community seeking help and seeking that hope, and really just conveying of how your faith community, your place of worship can be a source of hope for those individuals, and how being inviting, being open about it, having resources, not being afraid to tackle the subject can really start to tear down some of those walls that stigma and things have built up around having suicidal ideation. There's so many different things that come up in the faith community, and Reverend Drew really, talked about some of these around, just praying it away. And, if you have a certain level of faith, you wouldn't be, dealing with this on this level or having these type of stuff. And we all know that it's not a crisis of faith. There are other things and factors that are a part of that. And so a faith community, even just the sign of a faith community being willing and open to address this issue really can break down barriers. And so really what I've seen be most impactful is starting from a place of hope. In every faith community, there is one of the strong pillars of any faith community is hope. And so starting from that point and saying that we can be that hope for people that are already in our faith community or people who will be coming to our faith community who are dealing with this, we can be on the front end of this. We can have things in place, and we can be able to meet people where they are to give them a sense of hope that could ultimately save their lives, save their children's lives, one of their friends, etc. And so that has been a really impactful method of getting faith leaders to kind of understand what addressing suicide prevention within their place of worship or faith community can do.
Right, thanks for that insight. We also have a question about whether there are suicide prevention trainings tailored specifically to faith leaders and faith communities. So I don't know if any of the speakers know of some suicide prevention training opportunities that are available specifically to those target audiences that they'd like to share about.
This is Karen. I'll jump in. A number of us on the National Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force go out and do trainings to clergy. So, there's just quite a number of us that have done that kind of thing. There are some sort of very specific trainings that are in the process of getting developed by Living Works, I know. I think QPR might have a training for clergy. So there are some out there, and there are also ones that those of us in the task force who have been working on this who go out and do that kind of thing. So I think there are definitely a lot of different options out there. You might have to dig around a little, though.
This is Brandon. I think one of the trainings that I think can be helpful with this. The only problem is that it's a little lengthy overall. But mental health first aid and youth mental health first aid, I think, have been really good within working with faith leaders. Now, it is an 8-hour training, but if you go and look up, I don't have their website on the top of my head, but if you Google mental health first aid, you'll be able to find trainers within your local area. One of the good things, and I used to be a youth mental health first aid trainer when I worked in Maryland, and as a part of that, what's the really good thing around mental health first aid and youth mental health first aid is that you can kind of tailor the conversation and the examples that you use around the audience that you have. So if you have faith leaders in the room, you can pull kind of examples from that. And because you have so many different, you have kind of a database of trainers, you can find one or request one that, may, work in the faith community or may be clergy to maybe speak to that. But I know, it's pretty adaptable. And I did a training when I was in Maryland around with law enforcement, with teachers, with all sorts of different sectors. And I was able to tailor it enough that it would appeal to them, the examples would make sense for them, but the fidelity of the training remained consistent. So that would be one that I would say, and it really gives a breakdown of mental health in general and what people are experiencing, as well as there's a dedicated section specifically to suicide prevention.
And I'll also jump in on that one, that a lot of a lot of faith traditions, larger organizing bodies have statements and positions on suicide prevention. The Evangelical Lutheran Church that I serve has since 1999 had a formal theological statement, but also a lot of guidance and practice. The Presbyterian Church USA that I belong to has passed formal resolutions and giving guidance to congregants, to their communities for how to be actively participating in suicide prevention. So a lot of people a lot of pastors don't know the resources that their own traditions are providing them. So one thing would be to do a little bit of looking at what a local diocese or the larger gatherings of local communities, what materials do they have? A lot of them also have connections to some training resources from there. So I think that could be a very simple way of starting a conversation with faith leaders, is helping them to connect, if they don't know, to resources that are already framed for their tradition.
That's a great reminder. Thank you. And as we're running down on time, I just want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. I'd especially like to thank today's speakers for sharing their unique insights. A recording of today's webinar will be available soon on the Action Alliance website, and so we welcome you all to share information from today's webinar widely with your colleagues and networks. And just a final reminder, National Weekend of Prayer for Faith, Hope, Life is coming up September 6th through 8th, and you can visit the Faith, Hope, Life website for more information. Once again, thank you, and I hope each of you have a wonderful day.